everyone, and welcome to Managing Forests Habitat in a Changing World. We have a beautiful or wonderful panelist series today. We will be focusing on forest management for pollinators, and we have a great group of folks for you, and Haven will introduce them in a wee bit. But first and foremost, we have a couple of pre-webinar items to go over. We have wonderful ASL interpreters for you that will be coming in and out. We have two of them. And so please, if you need them, they are for your use. We also have a captioner that will be coming on as well. Currently, Zoom already has a good closed captioner, so you can use that. And yeah, so welcome from the National Conservation Training Center. We're here in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And I hope that you start enjoying the webinar series. I would like to start it with the land acknowledgement. So the National Conservation Training Center knows that we're located on unceded ancestral lands of many Indigenous people. While we can't find a full account, we are aware that many people traverse these lands and lived here. These people include, but are not limited to, the Massawomac, Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. If you're interested in learning more about the people who traverse the lands that you live and work on, let us know and we can send you a link so you can learn more about that information. Here at the National Conservation Training Center, we also welcome everyone. We acknowledge our agency's history and strive to be a site of cultural transformation for our organization and larger conservation community, making it more representative of the aspirations of the American people. Here at NCTC, you're part of the conversation and your contribution is valid. A quick disclaimer, the views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of the Interior. Some of the material is third-party copyrighted and may be licensed to us and restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references do not imply federal endorsement. We will be posting a few links in the chat to articles and journals, so please look out for that. And all of you are muted currently, but we do not want you not to be a part of this webinar series. And so in the chat, you can go ahead and introduce yourself and where you're from. It's been really cool to see where people are coming from. We have folks from all over, but very important, if you have questions for our panelists, and we'll add a half hour at the end of the webinar as normal for questions. But if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. You can see where the Q&A is down at the bottom of the screen. And so please post your questions in the Q&A and not in the chat, because we will be looking at the Q&A for questions at the end of the webinar. In terms of viewing the webinar, the best way to view it is through gallery. I've also been using speaker, so I think it's personal preference. All of our panelists and also our ASL interpreters are spotlighted, so you should be able to see everyone just fine. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Haven.
Thank you, Gwyneth. On behalf of the Fish and Wildlife Service Forest Ecology Working Group and our partners in science applications and migratory bird programs and at NCTC, and also the U.S. Forest Service, Northern Forest Climate Hub, and Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, whom have partnered with us to help deliver this webinar series. We welcome you. If you have any technical issues today, please send Gwyneth a chat directly, and she'll try to help sort out any technical issues. Additionally, today's webinar is approved for 1.5 hours of continuing education credit through Society of American Foresters or the Wildlife Society. If you need SAF credit, please email Jim Siegel. His email address is jim_siegel@fws.gov for documentation. Next slide. And before we begin today, I'll do a quick shameless plug for our next webinar series on July 15th. It'll be our seventh webinar in the series, and it'll focus on riparian habitat conservation and management. And we look forward to seeing you on that one as well. Next slide. So now I'd like to introduce our distinguished panelists for today. We're fortunate to have a pretty impressive and incredible bunch of scientists whom are some of the leading authorities in pollinator conservation and management. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jim Rivers. He's an associate professor of wildlife ecology in the College of Forestry at Oregon State University, where he leads the Forest Animal Ecology Lab. He has broad research interest, and he and his team have two major focuses. The first, they examine behavioral and demographic responses of animals to forest management and environmental change, and he has a particular focus on bird conservation. And the second focus is evaluating how insect pollinators respond to disturbances and land use activities in forested ecosystems. Jim's a fellow of the American Ornithological Society, and he currently serves as the senior editor for ornithology. He's also an associate editor for the Journal of Forestry. Before arriving at Oregon State University, Jim earned a PhD in biology from University of California, Santa Barbara. He has a master's in biology from Kansas State and earned his bachelor's from the University of Massachusetts. Jim will be working as the Charles Bullard Fellow in Forest Research at Harvard University this fall while on sabbatical from Oregon State. Next, we have Dr. Kamal Gandhi. She's the Wheatley Distinguished Professor of Forest Health in the Warnell School of Forestry at the University of Georgia. She is also the Interim Associate Dean for Research and the Director of the Southern Pine Health Research Cooperative. Kamal earned her master's degree from the University of Alberta and a PhD from the University of Minnesota. Her lab's mission is to understand the principles of community and population ecology of forest insects and to provide real-life solutions for forest conservation and sustainability. She works on a variety of insect taxa with a focus on terrestrial ecosystems and both dealing with integrated pest management and insect conservation and biodiversity. And we have Dr. Kass Urban-Mead. She's a pollinator conservation specialist with Xerces Society. Her staff develop technical guidelines and provide training on pollinator conservation practices. She's a partner biologist and provides tremendous assistance to the USDA in delivery of farm bill programs such as EQIP and conservation, environmental quality incentive programs and others. And she's involved in planning, designing, and implementing habitat management in a lot of different habitats, from forested to agriculture to urban areas, with a focus on insect pollinator conservation. She earned her master's degree from Yale School of Forestry, and her PhD is from Cornell Entomology Department, where she characterized wild bee communities active in early spring forest and forest canopies. We also welcome Dr. John Mola. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Forest and Rangeland Stewardship at Colorado State University. His research team focuses on forest and rangeland stewardship, bee ecology, and extension through their lab. I may nickname it the Freebie Lab today. They focus on applied ecology with the emphasis on pollinators like bumblebees and other native bees. John earned his PhD from the University of California, Davis, and prior to joining Colorado State University, he was a research ecologist with USGS. And finally, we have Dr. Michael Ulyshen. He's a research entomologist with the U.S. Forest Service in Athens, Georgia. He earned his PhD from the University of Georgia. Mike's research focuses on the importance of forest pollinating insects and how they are affected by prescribed fire, invasive plant removals, and other management practices. He also is interested in how the value of forest to pollinators varies with forest structure, composition, age, and landscape context. And so we welcome all of our panelists, a tremendous amount of expertise across a very broad range of relevant issues. So a little bit about process for today. We're going to have a little moderated discussion for the first 30 minutes. And during that time, my colleague, Lindsay Grayson, will be monitoring the Q&A. And please, as you have questions, drop them in the Q&A. When we have about 30 or 40 minutes left, we'll transition and begin to address the questions the participants have asked. So to start with, ask that each of the panelists take about 5 minutes to provide a little more detailed introduction, sharing a little bit about your experience in your work with forest-associated pollinators. And Mike, let's start with you, and then Kamal, Kass, John, and Jim, in that order. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Haven, and hi, everyone. I thought I'd start by sharing how I first stumbled into the world of forest pollinators 20 years ago, and then mention a few things that I've learned since then. In 2005, I was a graduate student at the University of Georgia studying beetles, not really thinking about bees at all. I was working on a side project comparing beetle communities between the forest canopy and the understory in a bottomland hardwood forest along the Oconee River, about 30 minutes from campus. So I pulled a series of flight intercept traps up into the canopy, 50 feet or more above the ground. And when I went back later in the season to collect the samples, I noticed that the traps weren't just full of beetles. Many of them were also packed with bees, especially these small, bright green sweat bees. Sometimes there were so many bees in a trap that other insects were literally crawling on top of them. I didn't know how to identify bees at the time, so I sent the samples across the Atlantic to a friend in Estonia. He identified 71 bee species in those samples, and the green sweat bee that had first caught my attention turned out to be more than 40 times more abundant in the canopy than near the ground. So even though I did catch a lot of interesting beetles in that study, as intended, the bees actually ended up stealing the show for me, and that experience marked the beginning of my interest in forest pollinators. Since then, there's been a lot of progress in understanding the importance of temperate deciduous forests to pollinators. Work from the Northeast shows that as many as 2/3 of native bee species use forests, including many forest specialists. Hardwood trees are increasingly seen as critical sources of pollen to forest bees in the spring. And here in the Southeast, flowering tree diversity has been positively linked to the diversity of native bees. We also know that pollinators in broadleaf forests readily spill over into adjacent land uses and have been shown to significantly improve the yield of at least 10 crops around the world. At the same time, research in conifer-dominated forests has highlighted some important contrasts. Conifers don't produce nectar, and their pollen appears to have limited nutritional value for bees. As a result, the canopies of these forests provide poor foraging habitat compared to those of hardwood forests. But management, especially things like thinning and prescribed fire, has been shown to improve conditions for pollinators in conifer forests by opening up the understory and greatly increasing floral resource availability near the forest floor. I think it's crucial to recognize that hardwood and conifer forests support pollinators in fundamentally different ways. They offer different resources and respond differently to disturbance. The upshot is that there can be no one-size-fits-all management plan. To effectively support pollinator diversity, we need forest-specific strategies that reflect these ecological differences. The Southeast, where I work, is an especially interesting place to study forest pollinators because of the mix of hardwood and conifer-dominated systems. The hardwood forests of the Southern Appalachians support pollinator communities that are distinct from those found in the pine savannas of the coastal plain, meaning that both are critical to regional pollinator biodiversity. In the Piedmont, which lies between those two ecoregions, pollinator diversity tends to decline as the area of land dominated by pine plantations, especially overstocked ones, increases in the surrounding landscape. These patterns highlight both the value of native hardwoods and the potential of open conifer systems when they're well managed. One consistent theme that's emerged from our work is the importance of habitat heterogeneity. Every management action seems to benefit some species while disadvantaging others. For example, prescribed fire can increase flower abundance and create bare soil conditions that many ground nesting bees prefer, but it can also be harmful to butterflies tied to specific host plants, even when those plants are themselves fire adapted. In large burn units, we've seen pollinator diversity decline with distance from the edge, while landscapes with a patchwork of burn histories tend to support more species overall. So managing for a diversity of conditions across space and time appears to be key. As I mentioned at the start, my interest in forest pollinators began with those green sweat bees I found by accident in trap cement for beetles. We've now been monitoring pollinator populations at 3 sites in that same national forest for over 18 years. And over that time, we've unfortunately documented significant declines in both the diversity and abundance of pollinators, including a 70% drop in that same green sweat bee species. So while we've made good progress in understanding how pollinators use forests, there's still a lot to learn. The more we recognize and work with the unique dynamics of different forest types, the better equipped we'll be to support the full range of pollinators that depend on them. Thank you.
Dr. Gandhi?
Yeah, hi everyone. It's great to see everybody attending the webinar today. So I'm Kamal Gandhi. I wear many different hats, as you heard, at the University of Georgia, and I came into the pollinator world in a very oblique way. I'm probably the newest kid on the block here. About 8, 9 years ago, a potential PhD student walked in my office and said, I love wild bees and I want to do a PhD on bees with you. And I was like, that's great, except I know nothing about bees. So Christine Fortune, who's now actually a professor at the Mississippi State University, I really collaborate a lot with her, but she really got the program going in my lab to the point where we have a substantial pollinator program. So part of it is, the fact that I have a strong background in insect conservation and biodiversity, working in many different ecosystem types, both in Canada and the US, but also the fact that I have a very strong background in forestry practices and silviculture as well. And then the other part of it is the integrated pest management as a forest health specialist on campus. So in some bizarre way, I've been able to weave all of these different fields together to better understand how different forest management practices may impact pollinator communities. And then the other side to that is I work very closely with our stakeholders. In Georgia, at least, we say 80 to 90% of our land is forested, and about 80 to 90% of it is in private hands. And they go from small landowners, what we call as minority landowners, less than 40 acres in size, to larger REITs and TIMO companies. And the fact that I'm embedded in the forestry school has been a tremendous asset because we have very close connections with these companies on a daily basis. So over the last many years, I've been in conversations. I still remember the first pollinator project that I drew together was I was visiting a company whose trees were dying. That's what I get called when the trees are dying. And, one night at a restaurant, middle of nowhere, Georgia, we actually sat and drew out all our plan for what we wanted to do in terms of a pollinator project. And that was a long time ago. So I've been very fortunate to work closely with these companies over these years, and they really want to be wise stewards of the forests. They really want to understand how the different management practices that they're doing, what are positively or negatively impacting biodiversity in general. And pollinators really fit the bill. Just because they are diverse, they are abundant, they are poster childs in terms of conservation and management practices. And almost like once a month or once every other month, I'm with a different company out there, talking about what they can do in terms of conservation practices. So most of my work has been in planted pine settings, although we have extended into other hardwood type forests as well, particularly the SMZs, the streamside management riparian areas, working with Kass and other companies. So today I'll be basically drawing on my experience in the last 8 to 9 years and what we have learned and a lot of conversations we're having with these companies on where do we want to go next in terms of learning more about our forest pollinators with a focus on wild bees. Thank you.
Kass?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Haven. My name is Kass Urban-Mead. It is such a pleasure to be here and really cool to see how much interest there is in this topic. So I work for the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, which is a nonprofit focused primarily on identifying the threats and stressors facing our enormously diverse and important invertebrates upon whom our life cycles depend. And then I am in that nexus in the pollinator team. Xerces has been around since 1971 and has been primarily working in agricultural landscapes and increasingly in urban areas and rangelands, and not as extensively in forested habitats because historically we haven't thought of pollinators as quickly when we think of forests, right? I feel like this is a more recent conversation that we think of, especially where forests I'm most familiar with, temperate deciduous hardwood forests. It's often dark. We think of meadows, we think of gardens, we think of yards. And so I think actually, similar to Mike, I wanted to start with how did I get interested in this to kind of explain a bit of why we're thinking about this at all and why we're trying to communicate so much more about the importance of healthy forests for pollinator conservation. And I also entered this world via an interest and love in agriculture. And then around the time that everybody started worrying a lot about what was called colony collapse disorder and the European honeybee, there was also an explosion of research around that 2007 era, kind of launching us into a new era of natural history exploration with a much wider range of funding and many, many more people getting into the party. And while we were looking in agricultural systems and asking, oh no, are there other bees if we were to lose honeybees? More and more of us in the public began to be aware of the huge diversity of wild bees. I don't think we've formally introduced that yet. I think that might be a useful thing to just start off early on in the webinar is we have over 4,000 different species of wild bees in the contiguous 48 states, over 5,000 on the continent. And the European honeybee is only one species, right? So we have an enormous range of different life history strategies, different flight periods, different flowers that different bees, and of course, I haven't even talked about butterflies and other species, right, yet interact with. And so that diversity and biodiversity of these different organisms also lays the groundwork for, okay, what are the ecosystems they evolved in? And then leads us towards looking at the natural habitats that we want to manage in order to support them, right? So with this enormous diversity of wild bees, then we're looking in agricultural landscapes saying, if there's no more honeybees, which of course is not true, but if there were, can our wild bees help us? And in that from that agricultural perspective, we were seeing, like Mike told us earlier, more and more positive relationships with things like forests, and that these organisms later identified as forest-associated pollinators are incredibly important for agricultural systems. So that has really led more and more research into different forested habitats to say, what's going on? What are these relationships? And that was certainly my personal research arc. Having started working on pollinators in agricultural systems, went to forestry school as an ecologist in meadows and was like, hang on, a lot of these bees are flying back into the woods. What are they doing? And then spending a lot more time figuring out the different relationships in this incredible, broader, growing research community of people saying, okay, we know there's bees that use spring ephemerals in the spring. We know there's bees that use understory forbs. We know there's bees that are reliant, as Mike suggested, on fire-adapted shrubs and forbs in the understory. We learned increasingly that bees are active in forest canopies and even rely on increasingly diverse forest canopies, especially of insect-pollinated plants and hardwoods, and that there's lots of nesting and overwintering with, I think, lots of open questions on how different management of forests affects the ways that bees can use the understories for nesting and overwintering. Yeah, so I think that as like a quick intro is the type of messaging that we want to support people in is yes, we want to help with all of the traditional ways of supporting pollinators and also in a historically forested landscape, managing for whatever is a healthy, diverse forest. Biodiversity begets biodiversity is going to be useful. So I'm in my role at the Xerces Society, we are developing a large number of public-facing guidelines and resources to introduce a lot of these different natural history threads that can be targeted at a landowner, at a forester, at communicating with practitioners. And then since, let's see, 22 years now, Xerces Society folks have been partner biologists with USDA. I have been embedded in field offices throughout the Mid-Atlantic and now work for a regional technical tech center. And so we can be responsive to helping foresters, state offices, field offices with interpreting and adapting materials to think specifically about how those programs can connect to, like Mike said, the winners and losers and what are the landscape specific gaps, what are the most important habitats maybe to think about, the species to focus on in any given landscape. So yeah, I think helping people understand that stewarding forests well is part of pollinator habitat is the big project. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kass. John, you want to share?
Hey y'all. Yeah, I'm John Mola. I am an assistant professor at Colorado State University. And I suppose to follow this theme of giving a bit of a character arc to how, people came to research forests and bees or forests and pollinators. I'm sort of coming at it from the bees first perspective. I saw a bunch of people in the chat are actually from Tallahassee. I did my undergrad at Florida State. And so first was working on bees, kind of interested in actually honeybees. I had an opportunity to go to the University of Florida's Bee College. It was like a weekend long seminar. I think this was 2008 or something like that. And there was one half-hour session on native bees, and I just was like, that's my thing now. That's my entire professional identity, I guess. And so then I went to Humboldt State to do my master's, where I focused on pollinators in orchards, and then eventually went to University of California, Davis, where I really focused on bumblebees and sort of have become really bumblebee focused. And I am allowed to admit that bumblebees probably get a lot more research than they deserve, proportionate to their taxonomic diversity. But I think that also makes them really interesting pollinators to talk about, because as Kass said, there's over 4,000 species of native bee in the continental US, but we know extremely little about the vast majority of those species. Bumblebees, there's still tons to learn, but one of the nice things is that we have a little bit better of a natural history record. We have some long-term studies. They're a little bit easier to identify in the field, so there's more resources like iNaturalist or amateur bee identification records over decades. And so we have data to know things like the rusty patch bumblebee, for example, was the first federally listed bumblebee species under the Endangered Species Act. And the rusty patch bumblebee used to be really common all throughout the northeastern United States, down into even Georgia, not as common in Georgia, but you could find it there, and parts of southern Canada. And this species, from the late 90s until the present, underwent massive declines, being lost from about 90% of its range. But areas where this species seems to hold on, at least on fine scales, seem to be associated with habitats that are complementary to each other, meaning that there's meadows and these open habitats where this species is active in the summer, but areas that have good quality forest, so these sort of temperate deciduous forests, seem to be areas where rusty patch bumblebee holds on. And so some of that is in the upper Midwest, where we find rusty patch bumblebee queens using understory spring ephemerals. As well, we have rusty patch bumblebee populations in the Appalachians. And so that really sort of piqued my interest in, kind of like Kass was saying, are these forests, these habitats that we're overlooking their value to bees and specifically bumblebees. And after that initial experience with rusty patch bumblebee, sort of started looking through the bumblebee literature and noticing this thread of like, oh, this study is about, bumblebee foraging range or population size or pathogens or whatever. It's not explicitly about forests, but there keeps being these predictive relationships between bumblebees and forests in some way. And so we put together what I think is a pretty accessible review on bumblebee ecology and conservation and its relationship to forests. Forests aren't super important to all bumblebees, but there are many kind of surprising relationships that pop up. And I guess the last thing I'll say is, I have some experience in the Southeast, being educated there. Have experience working in the Sierras and in forests on sort of the West Coast. And because of rusty patch bumblebee, I have lots of experience in the upper Midwest. And ironically, despite teaching forest ecology at Colorado State, I'm only just now really wrapping my head around what's going on with relationship between bees and forests in the Rocky Mountains, where we have less of a timber industry in that particular way, and relationship with pollinators. So I'll do my best to answer any Rocky Mountain specific questions, but I think that's kind of a fun emerging area of research, and I'll do my best to paraphrase the work of others like Seth Davis and Riley Gallis if we have region specific questions. But one last cool thing I'll say is another species that is worthy of listing, the Western bumblebee, or Bombus occidentalis. We don't know why yet, but when we do really large scale, like 10-kilometer grid size analyses of where Bombus occidentalis still holds on after undergoing very similar declines to the rusty patch bumblebee, it seems to hold on at least in areas that are associated with lots of forest edge. And so that might suggest that it's using those landscapes, complementarily for seasonal resources, or it could be related to when they nest or overwinter, or it could just be that that's such a broad scale analysis that there's something else going on, like good meadows are near forests or something like that. So it requires a little bit more targeted study, but I think that's a really interesting area of research and management in the Rocky Mountains, is specifically with Western bumblebee. And thank you for having me. And I apologize if I have to get up to manage pets. We are not in our usual house today.
Thank you, John. And Jim?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Haven, for that nice introduction, and good to see everybody here. It's really it's a great group of folks who've done a ton of research on forest pollinators. So I think of it as the North American all-star team of forest pollinators, looking around the Zoom room here. So like others, my background did not start with bees. In fact, I didn't even start with insects. And so I can't even call myself an entomologist, unlike the other panelists. I got interested in birds as a pretty young kid, followed that through college and into graduate school, where I did work focused around behavioral ecology. And so my dissertation work was looking at an obligate avian brood parasite, the brown-headed cowbird, and trying to understand how cowbird chicks make a living when they compete with other species, because as a brood parasite, this species lays its eggs into other host nests, just like cuckoos. And as I came up to Oregon State University for a postdoc, I started working on a project where we were looking at songbird diversity, and particularly demography, in areas that had been recently harvested. And these are intensively managed forests. And I remember talking to a colleague And he said, yeah, we're going to be doing some nest searching and clear cuts. And I said, well, good luck with that. I can't imagine there's going to be anything in there. And it really reflected my ignorance about the diversity of birds to start off with. And I remember standing in some of those clear cuts and just hearing a dozen species singing from one point count location. And so it really kind of changed my perspective on how we can have managed forests and actually have the potential to conserve biodiversity while also having some of those goods and services that we need. So as I was working on that project looking at birds, there's an opportunity to look at bees as well. And I was really astounded by the diversity of bees that I was finding, again, in these intensively managed clear cuts. And it turns out that we have more bee species than bird species here in Oregon. And we have upwards of 700 plus species of bees at this point. And so that kind of kicked it off. I realized that I should be looking at my feet, not just up in the air for biodiversity. And did one project that was really interesting. It's very descriptive, just trying to understand what bees were in our local forest that owned by the Oregon State University College of Forestry. And then took a pause on that. And I've been working with a lot of private landowners. And what we wanted to do was really understand what the private landowner needs were, as well as kind of the research gaps for pollinators in Western forests. And we brought a number of folks together, including Mike Ulyshen, who came out and gave a great presentation. And we had a workshop, and we were expecting we were going to have a couple of dozen people, and we had more than 100 people registered for that. And what was really interesting was not only how many people were involved, but we had these informed discussions. And at the end, we did a survey to say, what are the most important needs, whether you're an academic scientist, an agency, biologist, forest manager. And what we found was that there was consistency across all the different groups. And the key needs were understanding what species do we have in our managed forests, and then understanding what sort of management activities are going on that may be impactful on those bees and other forest pollinators. And so that led us to write up this research agenda, which I've been using for my research program here at OSU to try and focus on a lot of those different topics, thinking about bee response to wildfire, bee response to clear-cut harvest, herbicides, thinning, forest restoration treatments on the eastern side of our state where there's a lot of dry forests. And so it was a really eye-opening to be getting into this area after working with birds in so many years. And I think working with birds have actually helped inform some of the questions that I've had about forest pollinators, because much of the work that we do with birds is around reproduction and nesting behavior. And bees are no different in the sense that female bees that are rearing their own young are central place foragers, which means they can only go so far to get food, and they're providing some sort of parental care. So that opens up all kinds of questions and kind of parallels between the different groups that we have. As you've heard from some of the other panelists, we don't have the information about bees. And when I first started working on bees, I asked someone, what's a good field guide that will help me identify all the bee species that are out there? And I got a chuckle and said, the response was, we don't have field guides like you do for birds. And so that was also eye-opening in terms of how much research and just kind of life history information that we lack from many of these species. And even for some of the bumblebees, as John said, we know more, but we don't know a lot. So I think it's a really exciting time. It's great to see the work that this group and others are doing that's really expanding our understanding of pollinators and forests, and look forward to keep working on this topic for a long time. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim, and all the panelists for the introduction and kind of sharing your perspective and experience on, how you got caught up in pollinators in forest. I've got a kind of a general question about what should we be concerned about forest-associated pollinators, and what are their status? What are the status and trends of some of the forest-dwelling pollinators in the areas in which you work? And let's just go in the same order, starting with Mike.
I think we should be concerned. I think biodiversity, of course, has value for its own sake, but also as Kass mentioned, there's this movement of pollinators from forests into adjacent land uses, and a lot of the food we produce is actually from plants that require visits from pollinators to actually produce yield. So I think there's a clear economic reason to care as well. And I already kind of summarized some of the information we've collected from the Southeast on some of these declines. We're seeing like roughly 30% declines in species richness over 18 years of sampling at these long-term sites. I think abundance overall has declined by roughly 60%. So, these long-term monitoring studies are always full of some uncertainty because there's a lot of variation between years. But as we collect more data over time, we're becoming more and more confident that we are seeing declines here locally, which has really been disturbing to us because at these sites that we've been revisiting, there's really been no obvious external disturbance that's an obvious like indicator that something might be there may be some stressor being placed on these species. So that's still kind of an active area of research for us to try to clarify exactly what's going on. And we've noticed, I think one good hint at what might be going on is that the species that nest above the ground, like the ones that nest in dead wood, are declining more than those that nest below the ground. And I think that's a good hint that maybe they're being more affected by whatever the primary cause is than the ones below ground. And so our biggest suspect right now is this non-native ant called the Asian needle ant, which is really drastically increased in abundance since we started doing our monitoring. So there is a colleague who's an ant expert who's been doing repeated surveys here locally in Athens at a city park, and he's been sampling in 36 plots. And in 2011, he found the Asian needle ant in 8% of his plots, but by 2022, it was at over 90% of the plots. So over that same period that we've been doing sampling, locally, we've been having a drastic increase in Asian needle ant abundance, and that ant happens to nest preferentially in wood on the forest floor. So in our backyard, pretty much every piece of wood we lift up in the summer has the ants in them, and that, of course, is where a lot of these bees are nesting. So we're looking a little bit more closely at the possible role the ant may be having in these local declines.
Thanks, Mike. Kamal?
Yeah, I mean, no doubt. I mean, if we want pollination services, which is a very critical ecosystem service, we want to maintain our pollinators. We can look at ag systems, but even in forested areas, even in closed canopy forests, there's still flowering plants. There's understory plants and shrubs. And depending upon, what the layer is, if it's very well developed layer in the understory or in the midstory, and, over 75% of the plants are pollinated by some sort of wild pollinators, including bees. Bees are not the only one. There's a whole bunch of other insect taxa group. Birds, lizards, there are other vertebrate groups that provide important pollination services as well. So, for the overall health and functioning of the ecosystem, we want to keep as many parts as possible, knowing fully well that there are going to be some trade-offs. And where does that trade-off occurs is a critical question that we are asking, particularly in managed systems. And there's a trade-off between, I would assume, between economic and ecological services. And what does that graph looks like, and where the inflection point is what we have been really grappling with for many years now. Now, in terms of the other part of your question, Haven, was a decline. That's not something our group has studied. We have established long-term monitoring plots in longleaf pine savanna habitats in South Georgia. And pollinators bees are not the only ones that we're sampling. I'm really a coleopterist by training, to be honest. And so we've been sampling a whole bunch of different taxonomic groups and collecting a lot of stand structure attributes. So one of the things that's, kind of, I don't want to say partially missing, but we haven't paid much attention to, and we can do more of it with time, is to really get down to the nitty-gritty details and start defining those microhabitats within forest stands. We manage at the stand level, although we are talking more and more about the landscape level approaches. But from the other studies, it does seem like that there are some impacts on pollinators. We also have to be cognizant about the different functional groups that are out there. So, nobody is going to manage for all the species, particularly for insects, and it's hard to pick and choose, but perhaps we can put them in different bins. And so as the stand matures and ages, you get more and more litter depth, for example, and 2/3 of our bee species tend to be more on the soil nesting side. So that's something our group has really grappled with. Are we seeing some species being weeded out and other species being enhanced, or certain functional groups that are being enhanced with time? So I think the question about the successional pathways is critical. And we also have to remember, we don't have a good reference. We weren't sampling these sites in the prehistoric time, and our forests look vastly different than they used to be. So yeah, so our group has not worked with the decline component. And we do sense that there's an urgent need to learn more about what our population levels are going to look like, particularly under climate change and all sorts of other land use pressures that we have.
Thanks, Kamal. Kass?
Yeah, I think I want to just start by echoing the poor baseline data for many of these taxa, but also alarming evidence of declines in overall insect diversity and abundance in many landscape contexts overall. And I was thinking of maybe taking like a goal and then threat-based approach to how to answer this question. I think I do think about kind of where does the goal of conservation of the maximum number of species and the goal of optimizing pollination services, when are those the same and when are they kind of complementary goals? And so when I think about conservation of rare species, we have exceptionally poor data or specialized relationships, maybe as another way to think about that. And that luckily brings us pretty directly to just managing for diversity. But a really powerful example to kind of help explain what I mean by that is the loss of chestnut, right? We think about these different threats or a loss of a single species. Just from the bee perspective, we know there is a bee that is specialized on chestnut pollen called the chestnut bee, the Andrena rainey. It actually seems to still be holding on, but I think it's a really great, amazingly, but it seems to be a great poster child for the way that every time we lose a species in our landscape, I'm thinking about pests and pathogens and increasing pressures on our forests. We lose, or we at least put pressure on the associated invertebrate taxa. And so those that have highly specialized relationships are going to be potentially at, acute risk. I think about, what's happening to beech. The way that beech bark disease has affected the northeastern forest in many indirect ways is really striking. But then with beech leaf disease, if we're going to lose beech altogether, what does that mean for things that are associated with its leaves or its flowers or its bark or its root systems? So kind of this species-based approach is one of the ways to think about the biodiversity. So that's like thinking about conservation for its own sake, like the integral species communities that are related to a healthy landscape, right? And I feel like I use the word healthy, many of us use the word healthy, and of course that's incredibly context dependent, landscape based, and not always universally agreed upon. But if we're thinking about it as like an end goal of being able to adapt to future pressures, being able to maintain a wide suite of different ecosystem functions, whether that's a healthy, resilient timber market in your region to support a forest product industry and or wildlife biology. And yeah, so we need our forests doing that work, whether our goal is to conserve like the super rare and specific relationships, or those that are doing both that and then providing also those agricultural benefits. And so then that's the transition idea, is many of those species that have these strong forest associations will also do this transition into other habitats, right? And so that can be a food security consideration. And we know that landscapes with forests support those pollination services in agricultural systems, and that even supporting adding a hedgerow in a highly diversified landscape, adding a tree in a park, right? There's evidence that even at smaller and smaller scales, the benefits of woody plants is really, really important. Yeah, and so I think a couple other stressors that I just wanted to highlight, and then I'll see the floor here, the window, is I think a lot also about something Kamal mentioned, which is habitat loss and high rates of small private land ownerships, which is a big reason that Xerces is working so directly with USDA and NRCS and so many of these agencies that can reach smaller landowners and provide financial support for doing a lot of restoration and forest health treatments that may be out of reach, especially in lots of parts of the Mid-Atlantic and the New England, where it may not be commercially viable to do the types of restoration treatments that a given stand may need, whether that's removing a diseased taxa, whether that's managing for resilience in face of future drought, whether that's helping restore canopy tree diversity in a stand that may have had a legacy of historical exploitative harvest, right? Maybe it was maybe there's a diameter limit cutting. These kinds of historical legacies that we're seeing. It can be really hard for a small landowner to afford those things, and so. Yeah, thinking about how to approach that while keeping forest as forest. And I think that I think of that particularly in a highly fragmented landscape where I particularly work, which is kind of that greater New England, Mid-Atlantic region, where we do see high rates of land conversion and habitat loss, which I think no matter how bad our baseline might be or how we want to think about looking back to different historical timeframes and then managing forward, we do know that we don't want to continue land conversion from forest to other land uses, because we know that even if our forests need desperate help and stewardship in order to maintain maximized forest diversity of understory specialists, mid-story, early successional associates, and mature associates, we need that to be forest in order to do that active work. So that's a major message that we're working on supporting folks in is, while you're doing your landscape enhancement in an open habitat, also look back at your forest and don't convert it to a meadow. Maybe do a harvest if you need one, or maybe do a forest restoration treatment of some kind in that forest. Active stewardship is really important, but we don't want to be losing forest because that will lose our forest associated taxa. Yeah, I wanted to talk about deer. I wanted to talk about invasive species and concerns about jumping worms and other non-native worms, especially in our historically glaciated area. But I'll flag those for later for fun. Go for it, John.
Yeah. So, on this topic of why care about forest bees or what the value is, the main points that come to mind to me are that spillover into agriculture and that sort of economic value, though that comes secondarily to me behind just the intrinsic value of biodiversity. But one other kind of lens that I think is worth thinking about is, we're talking about these major biodiversity crises, and we need as many avenues to reach people as possible. And when we think about forests and restoring historical disturbances in forests or restoring historical structure in forests, bees are really popular. People don't understand bees. I was trying to find where my summarized note is, but I'll give approximate numbers. But we did a survey of something like 800 people in Colorado, and I worked with actual social scientists on this, so they did a good job on designing the survey. And we found, vast public support across political identities, across all sorts of demographics for bees. Most people didn't know the difference between honeybees and native bees, but that's a point of education that we can track. And then in a related study that we did, where we showed hypothetical landscapes within park systems in Colorado, where the landscapes were either approaching natural or they were more sort of a king's garden, like a typical European style parkscape. People that liked bees and knew more about bees were more likely to have favorable opinions about that more natural style of park. And so if we want to reintroduce, thinner forests, because that reconstructs some sort of historical stand density or something like that, or we want to not naively try to stop things like beetle kill during natural outbreaks, because we know that they have knock-on positive effects for species of interest, and we can encourage people through other types of biodiversity that they're interested in, like bees, to see the value of those disturbances for these species of interest. That's just yet again another pathway for us to engage people with biodiversity conservation. So if bees are popular, rightly or wrongly for what people know about them, we should leverage that popularity to apply the sorts of restoration that we see as valuable within landscapes. And we're talking about bees and pollinators today, but a lot of these same knock-on positive effects on pollinators when you see changes in forests, they have those same positive effects for all sorts of other species that we might be interested in, like Jim and thinking about bird biodiversity. So yeah, I think it's like a win-win scenario and gives us, another lens to engage people. And then the last thing I'll say is, if you like coffee, then you love forest pollinators.
Thanks, John. Jim, anything to add on why it's important or what's happening with the
we've heard a lot of good things, and I don't necessarily have anything to add. And given that we've got some other questions, I'm happy to cede my time.
I think I've got a list of questions as well that I'd like to come back to, but we have questions in the Q&A already, and I'd really like to hear from our participants. So I'd encourage you, if you have additional questions, continue to put them in the Q&A, and I'm going to go to Lindsay to start sharing some of the questions that we're receiving from the participants.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to jump right in. How important are canopy gaps for bee conservation and protection? And what are some steps that forest managers could take to maximize the benefit to pollinator species in those canopy gaps?
Can I jump in on that?
Yes, that is an open.
Okay. So yeah, a bunch of us studies that have looked at different stand ages, for example, including unthinned and thin stands, and stands that have been thinned and then herbicide applied, have clearly shown that that there are positive impacts on both the numbers and the diversity of wild bees. Bees, this is something I had to get my head around coming from the beetle world. Bees really like open habitats for a number of reasons, because obviously there's the flowering plants, and there's a flush of them in those gap formations, but also especially when in disturbed areas, and our southeastern forests are mostly vastly disturbance adapted, and that's the other thing I had to get my head around. coming from the Great Lakes region and the Pacific Northwest is that, disturbances create a lot more different habitats and niches and different varieties of nesting habitats for the bees. So by and large, we have seen, and the other way to put it in quickly is that anything you do that is considered proper silvics and good silvicultural practices and that enhances tree health to a large degree, also tend to enhance these bee populations and communities.
Lindsay, I'll piggyback on Kamal's comments in kind of adopting a Pacific Northwest perspective. We've been working in intensively managed Douglas fir stands in the Oregon Coast Range, and so this is a highly productive area. And what we find is that we only really find bees in intensely managed plantations in that early cereal period. So we see a spike shortly after harvest. For the reasons that Kamal mentioned, we see the trees are not present, or they're present in kind of the small seedling variety, and so we often have incredible growth of the understory. In fact, chemical herbicides are often used in commercial timber plantations for that reason, just to give the focal species an opportunity to grow. So we see a lot of flush of floral resources. We see mechanical disturbance to the soil, which can favor soil nesting species. And that all happens in a very truncated period. So one of the things that we've talked with folks about is that if you are interested in promoting bees, keeping that canopy open as long as you can is really a benefit. And we don't have great records on this, but some have said that the early cereal period in this part of the world could have been 50 or 60 years long. And so right now, what we're finding is that we have canopy closure in these intensely managed plantations 11, 12, 13 years. And so as soon as that canopy closure occurs, we don't see the resources in the understory for the bees, and we don't see bees in those areas. So it becomes really important to think about that. There are other opportunities for openings, either silvicultural openings where small gaps might be created or thinning is undertaken, but also things like roads and log landings and other areas where the forest is being managed to support perhaps timber production or other uses. And those areas can be particularly used by native pollinators as well. I don't think we have a great handle on what's there, but some of the work that we've been doing is finding that we do see even greater richness along roadsides than we might see in the interior of a burned area. So anything that managers and landowners can do to kind of keep that forest open, create gaps, I think is going to be beneficial to bees, at least in this part of the country.
I've got one thing to add to that. I agree with everything Jim and Kamal said, but I'd like to point out that I think the experiences they're pointing to there are primarily in conifer systems. And I tried to make that distinction between conifer and hardwood forests in my introductory statement because I think it's so critical for people to know the distinction. So in deciduous hardwood forest, there's a tremendous bee diversity that seems to be quite dependent on that forest type that's active early in the spring. And by early in the spring, I mean like as early as February, and the season for them might end by May. I mean, very early. And so these are like true forest dependent species that seem to a large extent to be using these hardwood trees as pollen sources. So I know Kass can give more details and all that than I can. But I just want to point that out, and I'll just mention one anecdote from our own research, which was done up in North Carolina and the Southern Appalachians. We were sampling bees kind of throughout the season up there in closed canopy conditions, but we also did some sampling in these small roadside meadows next to those same forests, and we found that we caught as many species in those roadside clearings despite sampling 11 times more intensively in the closed canopy forest. So these little native wildflower meadows embedded in a matrix of closed canopy deciduous forests look like they can be really critical, which is consistent with what Jim and Kamal are mentioning from conifer systems. But the distinction I want to make is that the information we have at this point seems to support the conclusion that closed canopy hardwood forests are very important to these early spring pollinators that are largely limited to those systems. And Kass probably has a lot to add to what I just said there.
I like the framing of the canopy gaps as a question. I totally agree with everything everybody else has said too. Because I think a question I get a lot is how big should the gaps be and how far away should they be? Thinking about like a temperate deciduous forest, a more music system. And we don't have a really good answer for that because we're dealing with such a hugely diverse community that also not all of the natural history is still fully understood. But one thing that Jim highlighted earlier that I think was a great place to start is the idea of being a central place forager. So unlike many other insects, bees go home to their nest after every trip that they take, is what that means, right? Just repeating that idea. And the smaller the bee is on average, the less far it can go. And when we think about enhancing pollinator habitat in a forest, that 250-meter radius that a small bee might need in order to get all of its floral resources, I don't think means we need a meadow every 250 meters, right? That doesn't make sense. That's not the landscape our forests evolved or our bees evolved in. But I think that it does lend support for, and I know Haven had maybe had a question about ecological silviculture later on, right? Thinking about forestry that's emulating historical disturbance, the types of complexity that we end up with that include canopy gaps, that include bigger downed trees, that include openings, and if we were suppressing disturbance, allowing for, gaps and openings of different sizes that simulate disturbance, those feel like the sizes that many of our small forest associated and even really mature forest associated taxa may have always relied upon. Because bees do like foraging on flowers in the sunshine, right? That's true. And many of them will also nest in really dark, closed forests. And we know that their foraging ranges aren't that far, and we'll find them consistently there. And so that kind of complexity, is why I get really excited about heterogeneity as the name of the game, and heterogeneity with an eye to what is the history of that landscape and what types of habitat are missing if you take a landscape scale view of your site. And just anecdotally, because anecdotes are more fun, I was in a hemlock forest 2 days ago on a north-facing slope and really wasn't paying any attention to my friend because there were bumblebee queens every 10 steps that I took searching for nests. And it was dark and it was, they were like, well, here's a nice layer of duff. And I was being told a really nice story about somebody's day. And I was like, oh my God, that bumblebee queen just went into the tip up. What is it doing in the root wad? Is it going to start its nest right under the root wad? And I was like losing my mind. And that was really, really cool. And, that is in a heterogeneous landscape. So I have no doubt that some proportion of those bumblebee queens are going to successfully establish their nests on that hillside layer. And then they're going to be able to start their colonies, build up a worker base, and fly, less than a kilometer in order to find floral resources throughout the season. Whereas I didn't see a ton of things for a solitary understory forb reliant solitary bee who, like Mike says, might fly just April to March and might need a specific understory forb. And for that bee, that would have to be the deciduous forest, a mile away. And that's where we would find that bee, and it would only be active in that spring period. So happy, yeah, I'll stop there.
When we talk about managing for openings and especially maintaining that early cereal habitat, in timber-dominated landscapes, we especially are trying to almost limit that amount of time. But kind of something that comes along with both of those things is competitive vegetation, whether they're invasive, noxious, or native and just unwanted. How do things like competitive vegetation management, invasive species management, buckthorn, herbicides, how are those impacting both species diversity for pollinators and their overall abundance and health? Again, this is an open.
So I think
It
Mike's
should be
group
people
has
managing for them. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I think Mike's group has worked more on the invasive plants, but quickly on the herbicide side, we have done studies looking at the effects of herbicide on pollinators in early sterile habitats and in mid-rotation stands. And we actually found that it actually enhances bee numbers or diversity, or it has no impact. And there are some differences in species composition. Now, if you're going to spray herbicide directly on the bees, yeah, you're going to have negative impact. But these are either aerial sprays or backpack sprays. So it's a vastly different procedure that's done. So I'll hand it over.
Yeah, thanks, Kamal. As Kamal mentioned, we have had a long-term study looking at the restoration of pollinator communities following the eradication of Chinese privet, and it went on for 13 years. It's kind of shutting down now, but we saw a sustained positive effect of eradicating Chinese privet from the mid-stories of these riparian forests here locally in Georgia. And that problem of invasive shrub layers is becoming more and more widespread. And as that question suggests, buckthorn is a big problem farther north. Bush honeysuckle is a horrendous problem in the Midwest and elsewhere. And then an emerging problem that could be worse than even those seems to be calorie pear, which you see blooming in every road median in the eastern U.S. right now. And is choking out everything and doesn't give anything a chance to even regenerate in early sterile habitat in a lot of places now. So yeah, and I think a general rule can probably be eradicating these non-native invasive plants. It's going to be beneficial to pollinators near the forest floor, and will also allow for the regeneration of these hardwood trees, because that's what we're seeing in this privet study, is that over time, the privet forms such a thick layer that, I mean, we've actually witnessed this where a huge overstory tree will fall, the body of the tree gets swallowed up in privet, and there's simply no opportunity for any seedling to break through that layer. And so, our span of experience is so short in our lifetimes that we probably won't live to see this, but it doesn't take much imagination to imagine 100 or 200 years down the road, you're left with a thicket of these invasive shrubs, and there's no native forest overstory at all at that point. So that's kind of what I envision, doing nothing leading to in these sorts of choked out invasive systems.
Oh, Jim, you want to go?
Yeah, just briefly on the herbicide piece, there's a paper in the chat by Corman et al. 2021, and that was a paper where we had undertaken an experiment looking at herbicide application intensity in the Oregon Coast Range. Again, this is Douglas fir plantations. And we found contrasting differences in terms of what's been found in the Southeast, and that species richness was reduced at higher levels of herbicide application intensity. Abundance was not impacted as much. And what we think is going on is that there's a shift from native plants to exotic forbs with more intensive herbicide application. And so that's something that we've really just started scratching the surface of, and we're interested in doing more on that. But that becomes a real challenge, because land managers are, their goal in many cases is to focus on timber production. And so one of the potential outcomes from this broader studies, because we didn't just look at biodiversity responses, we looked at tree responses as well, is that you may not need to spray as much herbicide. And if you can give those saplings or those seedlings rather a boost early on, it may be enough to keep them going. And I think that, if that pans out, again, this is as Mike said, this is a long-term perspective we have to take if we're thinking about tree growth and the impact of herbicides, and not kind of backing off on herbicides. It's going to take a long time for that to come, so that we have data on it. But it's still, managers don't want to spray more herbicides than they have to because of the social license, but also because of the cost. Getting in a helicopter and spraying chemicals is not cheap. So if there may be a sweet spot, and I think that bodes to doing some more research to try and figure out where that may be, and it might be a win-win.
I'm just going to really quickly mention kind of deer. We have a lot of challenges where folks will spend a lot of effort removing invasive species that are not preferentially browsed. And then if you aren't changing the underlying condition of really high levels of deer browse, you're just going to get that same return of the same understory community again. So I think about that a lot in terms of just allocation of labor and what are the underlying conditions that have led to the shift, which I know we all think about, but I want to highlight that that's a great kind of entry point into the conversation about the regions of the country where we are dealing with really high or a historically high densities of deer. Hundreds of deer per acre kind of levels. It's really hard for any of the forbs or the trees upon which our healthy forest associated communities can establish. So that's, I think, maybe a gift, hopefully, to the audience in terms of the communication strategies for foresters is like the pollinator people want to help think about how to have healthier balances of deer, at least in the regions where I work. It's kind of a front and center conversation. And also in the spirit that, thanks, John, for bringing up the communication arc again. A common question again that I get is, well, the honeysuckle flowers. Well, the calorie pair is flowering. It's good for the pollinators, so that means it's fine. And so again, coming back to our natural history grounding of the diversity of the life cycles of all of these different bees. Not all of them are active when one homogeneous understory of, any given, pick your favorite dominant understory shrub is flowering. Many of our forest-associated solitary spring flying bees are out really early in the spring, maybe many months before that invasive species is blooming. And often also have restricted host preferences. They may not. They may be generalists in the sense that if they were out, if they flew, if their flight period overlapped that invasive species, some of them will be able to switch. And certainly honeybees, generalist foragers, many bumblebees will be able to take advantage of those. So maybe if there is no way to change it, maybe there's some invertebrates that are certainly going to be able to use those. But there are many other taxa that, just like Mike said, if that's smothering your hardwood regeneration and also a native understory of forbs, you're also losing all of those taxa that are associated in it. And I sent one just really elegant study of bush honeysuckle smothering out geranium, wild Geranium maculatum, and Geranium maculatum has a specialist bee, Andrena distans, which only collects geranium pollen as far as we know. And that study did a really delightful job showing that when you remove the honeysuckle, you get the geranium back, and they even found the restoration of the seed set of the geranium. And so, that's anecdotal or, one really beautiful study, but that's the idea. So I'll pause there.
Okay, I'm going to try and squeeze two more questions in. Okay, one of which is we talked a lot about specialists and how many of these species are specialists or are restricted to a small number of host species. And we are seeing a lot more threats, especially the western forests have already seen a lot of them flow through, but our eastern forests are seeing a lot more from oak wilt, emerald ash borer, maple wilt, the various beech diseases, etc. How can forest managers and forest owners manage their forests to still support some of these pollinator species or guilds that require specific things? Should we still be managing for overall forest health and function? Should we be trying to support specific species? I realize that's a very big question, but
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer because all of those species are hardwoods. And we have published a paper a long time ago, indicating that the different species, arthropod species in general, that are host specific to ash trees, for example, and we have 16 species of North American ash right now. and they're all threatened to a large degree because of emerald ash borer. So having said that, I'm going to speculate, and I do think that we do need to go and test these hypotheses and these models, these hypothetical models that we're developing, and we talk about heterogeneity. That is absolute key. Maintaining different forest ages, forest types, different structural and compositional attributes, different management types is going to be critical. But what does that actually means, particularly in the southeastern region, we're really debating it at this point. And I do think we need to start moving from the stand level approaches that we're doing, which are very, very valid, absolutely valid, to more landscape level. But even trying to define what a landscape level is at the scale at which these bees operate is a little bit tough. So the bottom line to me is you're going to maintain diverse habitats, you're going to have a higher diversity of native species, whether they're pollinators or they're something else.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, and one thing I'd like to add is managing for heterogeneity can be done on any scale. And I think that's really encouraging, no matter, if you live on 1 acre like I do or have 1,000 acres that you manage, you can make a difference by thinking about what habitat features can be protected or added, patches of flowers, certain trees. One thing we haven't touched on is dead wood. Dead wood is a critical resource for about a third of all forest insect species, including a lot of bees, and specifically including that green sweat bee I mentioned at the beginning. So if you have a oak stump in your yard, even though some people might call it unsightly, if you leave it there, there's going to be a lot of stuff living in there, and none of those things are going to pose a threat to your home or your health. So yeah, I think it's something that homeowners have more control over than I think they often realize, because even very local small efforts to improve resource availability can go a long way.
All right. I'm going to try and squeeze one more in real quick, and it's about fire. How can we manage fire on the landscape, whether that's prescribed fire or, I'm going to use dirty words here, using wildfire for management purposes or wildfire use or whatever you want to call it. How can we best utilize fire on the landscape to promote insect pollinators? Specifically, things we can actually change and and do, things we have control over.
Well, I'll maybe leave the control over part to folks in areas where fire is more, you have more choices, perhaps. But I will generally say that, for bees, in sort of a general sense, not getting into the weeds of any particular taxa of interest, when fire results in a higher abundance or diversity of flowers, you're going to have knock-on positive effects for bees. And you might see patterns like initially only large-bodied species recolonize if there's a large proportion of high severity wildfire or something like that. But generally, positive effects for flowering plant communities, result in positive effects for those subsequent pollinators. So folks have more region-specific knowledge, I'm sure a lot of people listening do, about what time of year to burn, or the patch size to burn. That results in a higher abundance or diversity of flowers, then you can almost rightly assume that that's going to have a positive knock-on effect for bees.
And I'll quickly add, this is where my disturbance ecology background comes in full force, is most of the pine-dominated areas or many of the ecosystems in North America are fire adapted. It just depends upon what the disturbance regime is, which includes intensity, severity, and frequency of fire in this case. So in our region, it's 2 to 3 years fire. And we have to remember that was maintained by an indigenous Native American communities. So going back to the traditional knowledge of how these forests were managed in the first place and how our taxa are adapted to these fire is very critical. And a lot of the fires were not dormant season. They were growing season burns in reality. And so the larger perspective is we really have to look at the ecosystem type. We really have to look at the forest type, and we really have to, particularly in terms of pines, really have to understand where they fall along the gradient in terms of their adaptations to fire. And whatever you do, it's gonna in my experience is what if you do proper silvics, it will positively impact most of the native biodiversity.
Thinking about wildfire in dry western forests, one of the things that there's been a big push towards is to try and have forest restoration treatments that get us back to kind of the more historical disturbance levels, as Kamal was talking about. And the good news is we've got a project going on now, and this is very preliminary, but we've been looking at bees in areas that are thinned, and then had prescribed fire, or reference sites that have been untreated. And what we're finding is in the thinned and prescribed fire sites, we're actually getting greater bee abundance. Still in the process of identifying those bees to understand which ones are there, but that suggests that if we start getting back towards more historical disturbance regimes, we might see those bee communities responding. And that's true of much of the Western US, where we have forests that have, at the current time, they're an artifact of how we've managed forests and how we've suppressed fire for many, many decades. And so I think this makes me hopeful that as we continue these restoration treatments, we'll actually have biodiversity, not just bees, but some of the other species as well that we've talked about, to start coming back into those areas and having healthier forests that are more resilient to fire. Because we know that these treatments are also good at reducing fire risk and reducing fuels as well. So I think some positive things coming out of that work.
I do just want to, and I don't know what's happening with my voice, but I do just want to jump back in to add something that I put in the chat. But I do sometimes get asked about concerns about fire-induced mortality with bees, and it's a challenging thing to study, but the limited studies that exist follow what we might expect just from the physics of fire. Soil heating occurs only a few centimeters underground for most fires, and so the mortality of bees is generally pretty limited. That's primarily been studied by introducing bees, solitary bees, in lab settings to heat and finding that they survive. But you might expect that if you're concerned about a particular species that has a really restricted population, like let's say you're working in an area with rusty patch bumblebee, which we know seems to nest at least a good amount of the time in forested areas, and you have a choice over how much forest you burn, then yeah, maybe to bat hedge a little bit, it might make sense to rotate and not burn all of that area at once while you have that particular species of concern. But for soil nesting species, which is most bee species, it seems that concerns about mortality from fire are pretty low. If you're concerned about cavity nesting species or those that nest in wood, then maybe limiting the area of burns makes sense. But generally,
John, I'm going to hop in. We're at the bottom of the hour, and I don't want to cut folks off because there's still more questions, and we could carry on, but we do have a hard stop. I do want to thank the participants for joining and being a part of today's webinar discussion. And I want to extend a tremendous thank you to the panelists, Mike, Kass, John, Kamal, Jim. We really appreciate you giving your time and talents to help share a great message. And please remember, next webinar, July 15th, noon Eastern. And that's it for today. Thanks to the interpreters and the team that put the webinar series together. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye, folks.
Well,
Thank you.